All right, the big controversy. LS or Big Block Chevy? Which is going to reign supreme? I'll tell you what, I had lots of comments from people on both sides of the argument. You know, the LS is the new school, the Big Block is the old school. The Big Block was the reigning champ. I mean, back in the day, if you had a Big Block Chevy in your Chevy pickup truck, you were the king. And now everyone seems to have gone LS, including myself. Yeah, we do a lot of LS swaps. But today we're going to answer some questions. Which is the reigning champion? All right, so today we are going to make 8 comparisons. These comparisons are going to be what I consider to be the most prominent talking points, LS versus old school engine argument. The very first thing I want to talk about is the availability to the engines. You see, back in the day, back when I was building cars for me to drive in high school,
in the 1850s,
a Big Block was hard to get a hold of. A 454 was the king. They were expensive to get a hold of. So we ran a lot of small blocks, you know, 350s if we were lucky, 327s, most of the time at 283. But now there seems to be more availability to Big Block and small block Chevys than there ever has been before. And the only reason I can assume that is because people have stopped building those engines and are now messing with LS. So let's talk about the availability to LS engines. Any of you who have priced an LS know that the 6-liter reigns supreme. Everyone wants a 6-liter. They don't like gas mileage, they like the extra torque, they like the extra power. So the 6-liter is the cool guy engine to have. But most of the time, people think they're buying a 5.3 and they really end up with a 4.8. So much so that Hot Rod Magazine even did a build on an engine that they thought was a 5.3, and when they tore it all down to do the next build, they discovered that the engine they were using was a 4.8. The difference between the horsepower and the torque on a 4.8 and a 5.3, after any performance parts have been put on, is very small. Hot Rod Magazine's already proven this. I don't need to prove this now. But availability to the 5.3 is actually pretty plentiful. They have built millions upon millions upon millions of these trucks and cars, and the engines are all over the place. So the engines are all over the place on both sides of the fence. So what about the cost? So it used to be back in the day that if you were going to get a 454 Chevy that needed to be rebuilt, you were going to spend $1,000 to $1,500. Today you can pick them up for less than $500, or at least I have in the past few months. The 5.3, the LS versions of whatever you're getting, the 4.8 or the 5.3, you can typically find those, an engine with a computer and a factory wiring harness, for somewhere between maybe $1,000 and $2,000. And depending on who you buy it from, you may have a good engine or you may not have a good engine. So the 454 to rebuild in comparison to the LS, really pretty similar. The LS is a little more expensive to rebuild if you go and have a shop do it. But if you do it yourself, you can actually be pretty economical on both options. So let's talk a little bit about the cost of performance parts. Believe it or not, the cost of performance parts on the LS are more expensive than doing a Big Block Chevy. Now you got to remember, all the guys on Street Outlaws and all those super duper shows, they're still, most of them, running a Big Block Chevy. And so there has been years and years and years of development, and there's additional vintage or old school parts laying out there that you can buy used, and you can still buy new also. But it seems to be less expensive to put together a performance 454 than it does to put together a performance LS. Now that being said, what are they in their stock format? Well, obviously it depends on which engine you get, which 454 you get, and which LS you get. 6-liter, 5.3, you know, did it come out of a Camaro, Corvette, truck? There are a lot of variations there. But just on the lower end, if you're doing just a Chevy 5.3 LS motor that came in a Chevy truck, probably 275 horsepower, and you're pulling a 454 out of a mid-80s Chevy truck, you're probably talking 195 horsepower. Right out of the box, the LS is typically going to have more horsepower. Let's talk for a minute about accessories. You know, it's easy to get alternators and power steering pumps and all of these things. But in the past two builds I've done, which is a 1965 C10 with an LS and a 1965 C10 with a big block, I can tell you there are a couple of things that really stand out. And here's what they are. Headers. Let's talk about headers. And if you guys haven't seen my header installation video on Brandon's Big Block truck, you need to go back and see what we're talking about. Because we bought headers for Brandon's truck that were specifically for a big block, and they didn't even come close to fitting. We had to completely alter the stance of the engine, where it sat in the frame. We had to cut the frame. We had to dimple a couple of the tubes. We had to do a lot to get those headers to fit. But the headers on the LS, they go in smooth as butter. So as far as the accessories are concerned, stuffing a big block into a 60s Chevy truck, at least the 60 to 66, is a little more difficult because it was never in that truck. Now an LS was never in that truck either, but it's a smaller package. It just makes it that much easier to do. All right, ease of installation. You know, both of them were pretty easy other than the headers that we're talking about. It's easy to get motor mounts and transmission cross members for pretty much whatever combination you want to put together. So as far as ease of assembling the engine and transmission combination, there doesn't seem to be much difference at all between these two. All right, so old school versus new school. So a buddy of mine at work, Eddie has a nice, I don't know, it's 71 or 72 Chevy pickup truck. It's got a nice little small block in it. And I think it has a turbo 350, but it might have a 700R. And it's just a nice truck. And, you know, he can drive it pretty much anywhere. And it's old school because it's a small block Chevy. And it has 0 computers. And that makes a huge difference as far as when you're out in the middle of nowhere and a car breaks down. It's so much easier to get that old school engine running again in comparison to new school. So the LS runs the LS computer, wiring harness. If you're using an electronic gas pedal, you have to have the TAC module. Everything has to be talking to each other. You have 1,842 sensors that are reading one another. You have O2 sensors and NOx sensors and cam sensors and crank sensors and temperature sensors and all kinds of sensors, and if anything goes out, you end up with a problem. But because of that computerization, it also enables you to be able to go in and with some programming be able to tweak that engine and turn that engine up for a very low cost. A stock engine, you can get upwards of 350 horsepower out of them if you have a good tuner. So let's talk about the overall cost of doing a project. Typically, if you were to take your car or truck to a fabricator and have them do an LS swap for you, if they provide the engine, they go through and do some basic maintenance on it, they're going to provide the motor mounts, at least the headers, they won't run the exhaust, they're not going to do gauges for you, but they're going to get it up and running or the radiator. Your minimum cost is going to be somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000, and it goes up from there depending on how elaborate the build is. Now I'm going to show you right now one of the builds I just did, and it was a 1983 Mazda B2000, and we stuffed a ginormous 5.3 LS in this thing along with a 5-speed manual transmission, and it was a chore. I'm telling you, there was so much work on this, and if I would have charged Arthur $100,000, it wouldn't have been enough. But it was a difficult chore, and it took a lot of fabrication. It took altering the firewall. We actually moved the engine back into the firewall about 8 inches. We had to move the steering box. We had to move the pedals. We had to custom build headers for it. We had to chop the cross member and reinforce it where we could bring the exhaust out. I mean, this was a major, major operation, and I didn't charge him anywhere near what I should have. If you were to have a fabricator go through and do something like that, I honestly would expect for someone to charge you somewhere in the neck of about $15,000 to do that. It was a lot of hand fabricated work. As far as the 454 is concerned, I would imagine that your build, if you're not going to do a full-blown rebuilt motor, if you're going to have a nice crisp running big block, and the same thing, it's going to run, but you're not going to do the full exhaust. you're probably going to be into it for less than $5,000. And I would think that would be a pretty conservative estimate. So let's talk about cool factor for a second. About 10 years ago, it was the coolest thing ever to have an LS in your car because there weren't that many people doing it. And the engine is great. It is a great engine. And it's nice to be able to put grandma in your car, her crank the key, and boom, it fires up and drives away. But everybody has an LS now. No, don't get me wrong. I love the engine. I still do the LS swaps all the time. But everyone has an LS. On coolness factor, I think you got to go back to the old school 454. It's nice to hear the rumble. It's nice to pop the hood and see a carburetor. It's nice to see a great big chunk of American iron. And that, I think it takes the coolness factor. So basically we have two completely different engines. One is a little more crude. You know, it's the Big Block 454. It has a whole bunch of torque and it has good horsepower. And you can get all kinds of used parts for it. You can build it a lot cheaper than you can do a really nice LS build. And then you have the convenience of the computerization, the get in, the one-touch crank, and the thing fires up and it drives all the time until the computer goes dead, and then you're stranded on the side of the road and there's nothing you can do about it. So I can tell you this much. I am not an expert on very many things. As a matter of fact, some people would say I'm not an expert on anything. But I can tell you this much. I have an opinion. And here's my opinion. Between the two of them, the route that I would go, I can't even begin to tell you. Because on the next video regarding our LS comparison, we're going to show you a head-to-head race with Brandon's Big Block 454 and Ben's LS swapped 65 C10. And we will do burnout contests, and we will do a race, and we will time the vehicles, and we will see which one is the better bang for the buck. They're two completely different builds. We built them within a couple of months of each other, and I'm going to get these two guys together and we'll have a little bit of fun. Now that won't be for a month or so because we still have to finish up Brandon's truck. But on our next LS versus Big Block swap, we are going to have the Olympics of 65 Chevy C10s. So I hope you guys stay tuned for that one. I hope you guys enjoyed what we talked about here, and I think we made some good comparisons. And either one, I would take, that's for sure. I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel. We have some really cool things coming up. We're going to be starting on that 55 Chevy blown gasser here soon. Please remember to share the link. Give us a thumbs up, do the bell notification, make a comment, let us know how we're doing. And as always, thanks for watching.